I never thought I'd be at a point where I'd share this story, but sometimes life has a way of turning your biggest humiliations into moments of sweet vindication. You see, my wife Sarah had always seen me as nothing more than a dreamer with empty pockets. But that night at the Morgan Stanley Gala, when she spotted me chatting with Jeff Bennett, one of the world's most influential tech investors, well, let's just say her champagne glass nearly shattered on the marble floor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You see, when I first met Sarah, she was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. She carried herself with this effortless grace, spoke with unwavering confidence, and had this infectious laugh that could light up any boardroom. Back then, I didn't notice the subtle ways she'd size up people's watches, or how she'd casually drop comments about someone's modest lifestyle. No, I was too captivated by her sophisticated world to see the materialism lurking beneath the surface. We met at a charity fundraiser, one I could barely afford to attend. She wore this stunning red Valentino dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and was talking about her work in private wealth management. I was just a guy with a laptop and a dream, working on what she'd later dismiss as some tech thing. Looking back, I should have seen the warning signs when she asked about my portfolio before my passions, but love has a way of blinding you to the obvious. Sarah had this way of making everything sound like well-intentioned advice. "Darling," she'd say, examining my worn leather briefcase with a slight grimace, "don't you think it's time to invest in something more professional?" Each comment was delivered with a smile, but they all carried the same message. I wasn't good enough, at least not yet. I remember the night I told her about my AI-driven sustainability platform. My eyes were bright with excitement as I explained how it could revolutionize how corporations track and reduce their carbon footprint. She listened, swirling her glass of expensive Bordeaux before saying, "That's cute, but shouldn't you focus on something more realistic? Maybe apply for a position at my father's firm." At the time, I thought she was trying to help. I didn't realize she was slowly chipping away at my dreams, reshaping them into something that fit her prescribed notion of success. Her world was all about appearances, the right clothes, the right car, the right address. Meanwhile, I was pouring every cent I had into server costs and development tools, working out of a tiny apartment that she refused to visit because it was in that part of town. Her family wasn't any better. The first dinner with them felt more like a cross-examination than a meet and greet. Her father, Thomas, a managing partner at a prestigious consulting firm, spent the entire evening asking about my exit strategy and tangible assets. Her mother, Victoria, barely concealed her disappointment when she learned I took the subway to their Hamptons summer home. And her brother, Alexander, a hedge fund manager, couldn't resist making jabs about tech bros living on ramen noodles. "So, you're developing some kind of app?" Alexander had asked, not bothering to hide his condescension. The way he said app made it sound like I was playing with toys rather than building a serious business. "It's actually an enterprise-level platform," I'd corrected him, trying to maintain my dignity. "It uses artificial intelligence to—" Yes, Victoria had interrupted, patting my hand like I was a child explaining a crayon drawing. "But what does it actually do? Make money?" Sarah had laughed then, that perfect socialite laugh she'd perfected over years of country club memberships and charity galas. "Oh, Mother, he's still in the development phase, but I'm sure something will come of it, eventually." That eventually hung in the air like a prophecy of failure. But here's the thing about people who measure success only in dollar signs. They often miss the bigger picture. While they were busy judging my worn shoes and modest lifestyle, they didn't notice that I was building something revolutionary, something that would later catch the attention of the very people they desperately tried to impress. Despite it all, I married Sarah. Maybe it was hope that she'd eventually see beyond the surface, or maybe it was my own insecurity telling me this was the best I could do. Whatever the reason, I said "I do" in a ceremony that her family made sure was appropriately scaled to my means, their way of reminding everyone that I wasn't quite up to their standards. The years that followed were a careful dance of enduring, subtle jabs and staying focused on my vision. Every late night of coding, every rejected investor pitch, every small setback became ammunition for Sarah's carefully worded suggestions that maybe it was time to be realistic and join the real world. Little did she know, the real world was about to show her exactly what she'd been too blind to see. The real turning point came when I started making significant progress with my platform. I'd refined the AI algorithms to a point where they could predict and optimize corporate carbon emissions with unprecedented accuracy. But I kept this progress quiet, not just from Sarah, but from her entire family. Years of their dismissiveness had taught me the value of working in silence. Sarah's criticism had become more overt by then. "Another late night with your little project?" she'd say, barely looking up from her Instagram feed full of luxury vacations and designer purchases. "You know, James at my office just made junior partner. He has a wonderful house in Greenwich." Now, the comparisons were constant, each one a paper cut to my confidence, but they fueled my determination rather than diminishing it. I remember one particular evening that crystallized everything. We were at her brother Alexander's promotion party. He'd just been made senior vice president at his firm. The event was exactly what you'd expect. Expensive champagne flowing freely, men in bespoke suits discussing their stock portfolios, women comparing their latest Hermes bags. I stood in the corner nursing a drink, watching Sarah work the room like she was born for it. "Oh, he's still working on his computer thing," I overheard her telling a group of investment bankers, her voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "But you know how it is with dreamers. Sometimes they need to fail before they can accept reality." The bankers laughed, that rich, confident laugh of people who've never had to question their place in the world. One of them glanced my way, offering what he probably thought was a sympathetic smile. "Tech's a tough game," he said loudly enough for me to hear. "My firm's always looking for good people in our IT department if you need a real job." Sarah beamed at him like he'd just offered me a lifeline. "That's so kind of you. Isn't that kind, honey?" She turned to me with that look, the one that said, "Don't embarrass me by being difficult." But what they didn't know was that earlier that day I'd had a private meeting with Marcus Chen, one of the most respected venture capitalists in clean tech. He'd seen the potential in my platform immediately. "This isn't just innovative," he'd said, reviewing the demo. "This is revolutionary. We need to move fast on this." I'd signed the initial term sheet that morning, $50 million in Series A. Funding, with a valuation that would have made Alexander's promotion look like a rounding error. But I kept quiet, sipping my drink, letting them bask in their assumed superiority. Sometimes the best response is no response at all. Later that night, Sarah was particularly cutting. "Did you see James's new Aston Martin?" she said as we drove home in my trusty Toyota. "That could have been us if you'd taken that job offer at her father's firm 3 years ago. Instead, we're still driving this thing." She gestured dismissively at my car's interior. "The car gets us from A to B," I replied calmly, thinking about the term sheet sitting in my briefcase. "That's your problem," she sighed. "You have no ambition, no drive to be more. Do you know how embarrassing it is when my friends ask what my husband does, and I have to explain that you're working on a startup?" She made air quotes around the words, as if my entire career was a bad joke. "I'm sorry you feel embarrassed," I said, keeping my eyes on the road. "Well, someone has to. Think about our future," she continued. Alexandra's husband just bought them a summer house in the Hamptons. Meanwhile, we're still renting that tiny apartment because you're pouring all our money into servers and developers and whatever else you waste it on. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I let her words wash over me. In the past, they might have stung, might have made me question everything, but now they just felt hollow. I knew something she didn't, that while she was busy comparing our life to others, I was building something that would change the game entirely. The next few weeks were a blur of quiet preparation. I worked with Marcus's team to finalize the investment details, brought on key executives, and set up our new headquarters. All while Sarah continued her daily routine of subtle and not-so-subtle digs at my career choices. "Another delivery of ramen?" she'd ask, spotting the grocery bags. "I suppose we have to economize somewhere since you insist on pursuing this hobby." Little did she know that while she was making snide comments about my grocery choices, I was in meetings with some of the biggest names in tech and sustainability. Fortune 500 companies were lining up to beta test our platform. The same VCs who wouldn't return my calls a year ago were now sending weekly meeting requests. But I maintained my routine. I drove my Toyota, wore my off-the-rack suits, and let Sarah believe what she wanted to believe. Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving people wrong. It's letting them stay wrong until the right moment. The invitation that would change everything arrived on a Tuesday. Sarah nearly missed it, tossing it aside with the junk mail before her brain registered the Morgan Stanley letterhead. I watched from the kitchen as she snatched it back up, her perfectly manicured, nails tearing open the envelope with barely contained excitement. "Oh my God," she breathed, her eyes scanning the thick cardstock. "We've been invited to the Morgan Stanley Global Innovation Gala." She looked up at me, then back at the invitation, as if confirming she hadn't imagined it. "But this must be a mistake. These invitations only go to their top clients and major industry players." I continued making my coffee, hiding my smile. "Maybe it's meant for one of the neighbors," I suggested mildly. "No, it's addressed to us." She frowned, scrutinizing the invitation like it might reveal its secrets. "It must be because of Daddy's connections, or maybe Alexander pulled some strings." The irony was delicious. The invitation had come because I was one of the event's featured guests. My company was being recognized as one of the year's most promising sustainability ventures. But Sarah didn't need to know that. Not yet. "We have to go," she declared, already pulling out her phone. "I need to call Carolina at Neiman Marcus immediately. There's no way I'm wearing anything off the rack to this." She paused, looking me up and down with a critical eye. "And you? Well, we'll need to do something about your appearance." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of Sarah's preparations. She treated the gala like it was her personal debutante ball, a chance to finally break into the upper echelons of society she'd been desperately trying to penetrate. She dragged me to 3 different tailors, eventually settling on a Tom Ford suit that cost more than my first car. "At least you'll look the part," she said, as the tailor pinned the suit. "Just try not to talk too much about your little project. These people are serious investors and executives. They don't want to hear about some pipe dream." If she only knew that my pipe dream was one of the main reasons many of them would be attending. The commentary continued as the event drew closer. "Remember to mention Alexander's firm when you're networking," she coached. "And if anyone asks what you do, just say you're in tech development. It sounds better than startup founder, less desperate." I nodded along, playing my part. Meanwhile, my phone was buzzing constantly with messages from Marcus and my team. The platform's launch was exceeding all expectations. Major corporations were signing contracts. Our valuation had doubled since the initial investment. But to Sarah, I was still the same dreamer she'd married. the one she needed to manage and minimize to avoid embarrassment. The night before the gala, we had dinner at her parents' house. It was the usual parade of subtle insults and backhanded compliments. So generous of them to include plus ones, her mother mused, sipping her wine, though I suppose they have to fill the room somehow. Alexander couldn't resist chiming in. Just try not to pitch your little app to everyone you meet. He smirked. These people deal with billion-dollar portfolios, not carbon footprint calculators. Sarah squeezed my hand under the table, not in support, but in warning. Don't embarrass us, the squeeze said. Know your place. I'll behave, I promised, fighting back a smile. If they only knew that 3 of Alexander's firm's biggest clients had already signed 7-figure contracts with my company. The morning of the gala, Sarah was a bundle of nervous energy. She spent hours with her glam team, emerging looking like she'd stepped off a magazine cover in a designer gown that probably cost as much as a small car. She'd chosen it specifically to make an impression on the right people. Now remember, she said as we got into the car, my same reliable Toyota, much to her chagrin, these are some of the most influential people in finance. Just try to fade into the background. Let me do the talking. I adjusted my tie, thinking about the speech I would be giving later that evening. Whatever you say, dear. And please, she added, checking her makeup one last time. If anyone asks about your work, just say you're between projects. It's better than admitting you're still trying to get your startup off the ground. I nodded, watching the city lights pass by as we drove. In a few hours, Sarah's carefully constructed narrative about our lives would crumble. The thought didn't bring me joy, exactly, but there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that all her assumptions were about to be challenged. Looking at her now, perfectly poised in her expensive dress, I wondered if she ever regretted not taking the time to really understand what I was building. If she ever questioned whether her judgments had been too harsh, too quick. But then she started critiquing my driving, reminding me to park far enough away from the entrance so her society friends wouldn't see our embarrassing car. And I remembered why this evening's revelation would be so satisfying. The Morgan Stanley Global Innovation Gala was everything Sarah had dreamed of and more. The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom was transformed into a showcase of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the crowd, while elaborate floral arrangements created the perfect backdrop for the social elite's networking dance. As we walked in, Sarah's grip on my arm tightened. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the sea of familiar faces from the covers of Forbes and Fortune. "Oh my God," she whispered, "that's Victoria Chen from Goldman Sachs. And over there, that's William Foster. He manages the largest tech fund on the East Coast." I smiled, knowing both Victoria and William had been early supporters of my platform. In fact, William had personally called to congratulate me on the recent expansion into European markets. But to Sarah, I was just her embarrassing husband who needed to be managed. "Remember what we discussed," she hissed under her breath. "If anyone asks, I'm between projects," I finished for her. "Don't worry, I won't embarrass you." She nodded, clearly relieved, then immediately brightened as she spotted someone she recognized. "Charlotte," she called out, waving to a woman in a Dior gown. "I had no idea you'd be here." Charlotte, who I recognized as one of Sarah's former college roommates, air-kissed her way over to us. "Sarah, darling, what a surprise. I didn't expect to see you here." The unspoken question hung in the air. "How did you get invited?" "Oh, you..." "No," Sarah laughed, that practiced social laugh she'd perfected. "Daddy's connections." She gestured vaguely, letting people draw their own conclusions. Charlotte nodded sympathetically, then turned to me with the kind of smile people reserve for someone they're about to dismiss. "And you must be the husband, still working on that computer project. Before Sarah could jump in with her prepared excuse, a voice boomed from behind us. "There he is, the man of the hour." I turned to see Marcus Chen striding toward us, his face split with a genuine grin. Sarah froze beside me, her perfectly practiced smile faltering slightly. "Marcus," I greeted him warmly, accepting his enthusiastic handshake. "Good to see you." "Good to see me. You're the one everyone's here to see," Marcus laughed, clapping me on the shoulder. "The latest numbers just came in. The European rollout is exceeding all projections. The board is thrilled." I could feel Sarah stiffen beside me, her grip on my arm becoming almost painful. Charlotte's eyes darted between us, suddenly very interested in this conversation. "Sarah," I said calmly, "you remember I mentioned Marcus. He's our lead investor." "Lead investor?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but Marcus wasn't done. "Lead investor and biggest fan. This man," he turned to Charlotte, who was now hanging on every word, "is a genius. His platform is revolutionizing how Fortune 500 companies handle their environmental impact. We're talking billions in potential market cap." The color had drained from Sarah's face. Charlotte was looking at me like she was seeing me for the first time. But the evening was just getting started. "Come on," Marcus said, grabbing my arm. "Jeff Bennett's been asking for you. He's interested in discussing a potential partnership with his climate fund." As Marcus led me away, I heard Charlotte ask Sarah in a stage whisper, "Your husband knows Jeff Bennett? The Jeff Bennett?" The next hour was a parade of introductions and congratulations. Each interaction was a small dagger in Sarah's carefully constructed narrative about her unsuccessful husband. Victoria Chen rushed over to discuss the AI implementation in our European markets. William Foster wanted to talk about expansion plans into Asia. Every major player Sarah had hoped to impress was instead seeking me out. I watched from across the room as she tried to maintain her composure, but her perfect facade was cracking. The woman who had spent years dismissing my work as a hobby was now watching that same work become the talk of the evening. The coup de grace came when the event organizer approached me. "Mr. Mitchell, we're ready for your keynote speech whenever." "You're prepared." Sarah, who had finally worked up the courage to rejoin my side, nearly choked on her champagne. "Keynote speech?" I straightened my tie, the one she had criticized as being too plain for such an event. "Duty calls," I said, simply leaving her standing there, mouth slightly agape. As I made my way to the podium, I caught glimpses of various reactions in the crowd. Charlotte was furiously typing on her phone, no doubt spreading the news through their social circle. Marcus was beaming like a proud father. And Sarah looked like her entire world had shifted on its axis. Standing at the podium, looking out over the sea of expectant faces, I felt a strange sense of calm. The room was filled with the very people Sarah and her family had spent years trying to impress: CEOs, venture capitalists, fund managers, and industry titans. And here I was, about to address them not as Sarah's embarrassing husband, but as their peer. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady and clear. "For those who don't know me, I'm James Mitchell, founder and CEO of Ecometrics AI." I caught Sarah's eye in the crowd. She was clutching her champagne glass like a lifeline, her knuckles white against the crystal stem. 3 years ago, I had a vision that many people, I paused, allowing myself a small smile, dismissed as impractical. The idea was simple. Use artificial intelligence to revolutionize how companies track, manage, and reduce their environmental impact. Not just through basic carbon footprint calculations, but through deep, predictive analytics that could transform corporate sustainability from a PR exercise into a profitable business strategy. From the corner of my eye, I could see Charlotte, furiously whispering to a group of Sarah's friends, all of them staring at me with a mixture of shock and newfound interest. Sarah herself seemed frozen in place, her carefully crafted social mask cracking under the weight of reality. Today, I'm proud to announce that Ecometrics AI has secured partnerships with over 200 Fortune 500 companies. Our platform is now operational in 27 countries, and our recent European expansion has exceeded all projections. But more importantly, we're making a real difference. In the past 6 months alone, our clients have reduced their carbon emissions by an average of 32%, while increasing their operational efficiency by 45%. The room burst into applause. Jeff Bennett, sitting in the front row, nodded approvingly. Victoria Chen was already making notes on her tablet. These were the same people Sarah had been desperately trying to network with all evening, and now they were giving me their undivided attention. But success isn't just about numbers, I continued, allowing my gaze to sweep across the room. It's about vision, about believing in something even when others tell you it's impossible, about staying true to your purpose even when people— I looked directly at Sarah now— suggest you should settle for less. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Who knew our situation? Sarah's face had turned an interesting shade of pale, and I could see her brother Alexander, who had somehow finagled an invitation, looking like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. Which brings me to our next announcement, I said, straightening my shoulders. I'm honored to share that Ecometrics AI has just closed a Series B funding round of $500 million, led by Bennett Capital and supported by a consortium of global investment firms. This puts our current valuation at $4.2 billion. The room erupted in enthusiastic applause. I watched as Sarah's champagne glass nearly slipped from her grasp. Her brother Alexander was frantically Googling on his phone, no doubt trying to verify what he was hearing. The same people who had dismissed me as Sarah's unsuccessful husband were now giving me a standing ovation. But this is just the beginning, I continued once the applause died down. Today, we're announcing the launch of our Global Sustainability Initiative. Working with our partners, we're committing $100 million to help smaller companies transition to sustainable practices. Because innovation isn't just about profit, it's about creating lasting positive change. Marcus Chen was beaming from his table, and Jeff Bennett was already making his way toward the stage. But my eyes were on Sarah, watching as her worldview completely imploded. The husband she'd been apologizing for, making excuses for, trying to hide from her high society friends, was now the center of attention at the very event she'd been so excited to attend. Before I close, I said, my voice taking on a slightly more personal tone, I want to share something. Success isn't always visible from the outside. Sometimes the people closest to us can't see the potential in our dreams. They mistake quiet, determination for lack of ambition, and patience for complacency. I could see Sarah shift uncomfortably in her seat. Several of her friends were now openly staring at her, connecting the dots between my words and her years of dismissive behavior. But true success isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right, about staying true to your vision even when others suggest you should be realistic or get a real job. A knowing chuckle rippled through the crowd. Every successful person in that room had heard those words at some point. So here's to the dreamers, the innovators, and yes, even the ones who are still working on their little project. This earned another laugh from the crowd. Because sometimes those little projects turn into billion-dollar companies that change the world. As I stepped away from the podium to thunderous applause, I caught a glimpse of Sarah's face. The woman who had spent years managing, minimizing, and apologizing for me was now watching as the entire room rose to their feet in appreciation. Her carefully constructed narrative about her unsuccessful husband had just publicly shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. Jeff Bennett was the first to reach me, pulling me into a congratulatory embrace that would have made Sarah swoon just hours earlier. "Brilliant speech, James," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Let's talk about that Asia expansion over dinner next week. My jet or yours? I smiled, knowing Sarah could hear every word. Let's use mine. We just added a new Gulfstream to the fleet. What followed my speech was a whirlwind of handshakes, business cards, and congratulations. Every power player in the room seemed to want a moment of my time, while Sarah stood frozen in her corner, watching her social world turn upside down. The same people who had been politely dismissive of her struggling husband earlier were now practically climbing over each other to speak with me. "James, we must have lunch next week," Victoria Chen said, touching my arm familiarly. "I have some ideas about expanding the platform into emerging markets." "Absolutely brilliant work, William," Foster chimed in. "My team has been analyzing your growth metrics, unprecedented in the sector." Each interaction was another crack in Sarah's carefully constructed facade. I watched as she tried to process this new reality, her perfect posture slightly wilting. Under the weight of her misconceptions, Charlotte and her other society friends had formed a tight circle nearby, their whispered conversations and darting glances making it clear that Sarah's carefully curated image was unraveling in real time. Then came the moment I'd been anticipating. Alexander, Sarah's brother, approached me with a completely different demeanor from his usual condescension. Gone was the smug smirk, replaced by an almost desperate attempt at friendliness. "James, fantastic speech," he said, too loudly, too enthusiastically. "You know, I always knew you had potential. In fact, I was just telling my team the other day about your innovative approach to—" "That's interesting," I cut him off politely, "because last month you told Sarah I was wasting my life on a pipe dream. Your words, I believe." Alexander's face flushed red. Behind him, I could see Sarah cringe. She'd been the one to relay his comments to me, probably never imagining this moment of reckoning. "Oh, that was just... I was only trying to..." he stammered, but I wasn't interested in his backpedaling. "If you'll excuse me," I said, turning away. "Jeff Bennett is waiting to discuss our Asia expansion." The look on Alexander's face was priceless. The same man who'd spent years mocking my career choices was now watching me dismiss him to speak with one of the most powerful investors in tech. But the real show was about to begin. Sarah's parents had arrived, fashionably late as usual, just in time to witness the aftermath of my speech. They stood at the entrance of the ballroom, taking in the scene with increasing confusion. Their daughter's husband, the one they'd spent years pitying and criticizing, was surrounded by the very elite they'd always wanted to impress. "Thomas, Victoria," I greeted them calmly as they approached, using their first names for the first time ever. "So glad you could make it." Victoria, Sarah's mother, was looking at me like she was seeing a ghost. "James, we had no idea." "No, you didn't," I agreed pleasantly. "You were too busy suggesting I take an entry-level position at Thomas's firm to notice what I was building." Thomas, her father, attempted to recover his usual authoritative tone. "Now, James, we were only trying to help." "Mr. Mitchell!" Jeff Bennett's voice boomed across the space. "We need you for the photo op with the governor. Bring your family. If they're here..." The irony was delicious. Sarah's parents, who had spent years trying to network their way into these circles, were now standing dumbstruck as their dismissed son-in-law was called away by one of the most influential people in the room. "Sorry," I said. "Not sorry at all. Duty calls, but please enjoy the evening. I believe Sarah could use some company." I gestured to where their daughter stood, still clutching her now warm champagne, looking lost in the crowd that had once been her element. As I walked away, I heard Victoria's harsh whisper to her daughter, "Sarah, why didn't you tell us?" All this time, but Sarah had no answer. How could she explain that she'd been so busy trying to change me, to fix me, to make me fit into her narrow vision of success, that she'd completely missed my actual success? The rest of the evening was a masterclass in karmic justice. Every person Sarah had ever tried to impress was now approaching me with business proposals and partnership opportunities. Her social circle, who had politely tolerated me at her insistence, were now desperately trying to get my attention. The evening was winding down, but the impact of my revelation was still rippling through the room. Sarah had finally managed to corner me near the dessert table, her carefully applied makeup showing signs of stress. Her hands were shaking slightly as she reached for my arm. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me? All this time you're actually successful," I finished for her, selecting a chocolate truffle from the display. "I tried to tell you, Sarah, many times, but you were always too busy comparing me to James from your office, or Alexander's hedge fund friends, or anyone else you thought was more worthy of your time." She flinched at my words, probably remembering all the times she'd done exactly that. But the valuation, the investors, Jeff Bennett. Why keep it secret from me? I'm your wife. I turned to face her fully, taking in her confused expression. "Am I? Because for the past few years I've felt more like a project you were trying to fix, a source of embarrassment you needed to manage. When was the last time you actually asked me about my work, not to criticize or compare, but to genuinely understand what I was building?" Before she could answer, Marcus appeared at my side. "James, the governor wants to discuss implementing your platform across state agencies. Time-sensitive matter." He glanced at Sarah apologetically, though we both knew he wasn't really sorry for the interruption. "Of course," I nodded, then turned back. To Sarah, "Excuse me, duty calls. Oh, and Sarah, you might want to check your phone. Your friends have been quite busy on social media." As I walked away, I saw her frantically pulling out her phone. I could only imagine what she was seeing. Charlotte and her other socialite friends had been documenting the evening's revelations in real time. The same people who had smiled politely through her excuses about her husband's little project were now sharing photos of me with Jeff Bennett, with the governor, with various industry leaders. The next hour was a blur of high-level conversations and strategic planning. I found myself in an impromptu meeting with the governor and his economic advisors, discussing how ecometrics AI could revolutionize state environmental policies. Sarah hovered at the edges of these conversations, looking increasingly lost in what had always been her natural habitat. "Your wife seems a bit overwhelmed," Marcus observed quietly during a brief lull. "Not quite the evening she expected." I watched as Sarah attempted to join a conversation with Victoria Chen, only to be politely but firmly dismissed. "No, I don't. Suppose it was. You know," Marcus continued, swirling his whiskey, "I remember when you first pitched me your idea. You mentioned that few people believed in your vision. I didn't realize your wife was one of them." "She believed in what she could see," I replied. "Unfortunately, she never bothered to really look." As the evening drew to a close, the contrasts became even more stark. Sarah, who had arrived feeling like she belonged in this world of wealth and influence, now stood awkwardly at the periphery. Meanwhile, I was in my element, discussing innovation and future partnerships with the very people she had spent years trying to impress. The final blow came when Jeff Bennett's wife, Diana, approached Sarah. I was close enough to overhear their conversation. "Sarah, darling," Diana said, her tone dripping with subtle mockery, "you must be so proud of James, although I must admit I'm a bit confused. At the Palmer Charity Gala last month, didn't you say he was still finding his way?" Sarah's face flushed. I might have, Diana mused, not letting her off the hook. "Interesting way to describe one of the most innovative CEOs in the sustainability sector. But then again, I suppose we all have our blind spots." The drive home was silent. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of my Toyota, the same car she'd been embarrassed to arrive in, staring out the window. Her phone kept buzzing with notifications, but she'd stopped checking them. I imagined her, Social media was exploding with the evening's revelations. "The car," she finally said, breaking the silence. "Why keep driving this when you could afford—" "Because it works," I replied simply, "and because I learned a long time ago that true success isn't about impressing others with what you own. It's about being confident in who you are." She flinched, slightly at that, perhaps remembering all the times she'd tried to make me into someone else. The next few days were a study in chaos. The story of the Morgan Stanley Gala had spread like wildfire through Sarah's social circles, and suddenly our quiet life was anything but. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and family, all desperate to understand how they'd missed the signs of my success. I maintained my routine, same car, same schedule, same focused determination. But now there was an audience. For every move I made, Sarah's friends, who had previously looked through me at social gatherings, were suddenly finding reasons to drop by our apartment. Each visit was a thinly veiled attempt to reconcile their previous dismissal of me with the reality of my success. "James, darling," Charlotte gushed during one such unexpected visit, "I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd bring over some of those artisanal cookies you mentioned loving. I had never mentioned any such thing. And I was thinking, my husband's investment firm is looking into sustainable tech. Perhaps you two should talk?" Sarah sat silently during these visits, watching as her carefully cultivated social hierarchy crumbled. The friends who had once sympathetically patted her hand while she made excuses for her husband's hobby were now practically tripping over themselves to connect with me professionally. But the real storm came from Sarah's family. Alexander was the first to attempt damage control, showing up at our door one morning with an expensive bottle of whiskey and a forced smile. "James, brother," he called out too enthusiastically, "I've been doing some thinking about what you said at the gala about vision and believing in dreams." He placed the whiskey on our counter, still talking. "And you know, I've always admired your determination. In fact, I was telling my partners just yesterday about how I spotted your potential early on." I let him ramble for a moment before cutting in. "Alexander, we both know that last month you told Sarah I was delusional for turning down that middle management position at your friend's company. Your exact words were, 'He needs to accept his limitations and get a real job.'" The color drained from his face. Behind him, Sarah shifted uncomfortably, probably remembering how she'd agreed with him at the time. "Water under the bridge," he recovered quickly. "Family is family, right? And speaking of family, I have this amazing investment opportunity I'd love to discuss." "I'll have my team look into it," I said dismissively, knowing I would do no such thing. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a video call with our European board." The look on his face as he left, a mixture of desperation and wounded pride, was almost comical. The same man who had spent years looking down on me was now trying to leverage our connection for his own gain. Sarah's parents were next. They arrived unannounced one evening, dressed for dinner at a nice restaurant. Victoria clutched her designer handbag like a shield, while Thomas attempted to maintain his usual authoritative demeanor. "James," Victoria began, her voice honey-sweet, "we've been doing some soul-searching since the gala. We realize now that perhaps we were hasty in our judgments." "Hasty," I repeated flatly. "Is that what you'd call suggesting I was wasting Sarah's best years with my pipe dreams?" Thomas cleared his throat. "Now, son, we were only thinking of Sarah's future. You have to understand, from our perspective—" "Your perspective," I interrupted, "was clouded by your own prejudices. You never once asked about my business plan, my development strategy, or my market research. You were too busy pushing me to take entry-level positions at your friends' companies." Victoria's grip on her handbag tightened. "We only wanted what was best for Sarah." "No," I corrected her. "You wanted what looked best to your social circle. There's a difference." The conversation continued in this vein, with them attempting to rewrite history and me calmly reminding them of their past behavior. Sarah sat silently, throughout, watching as her parents, who had always been so certain of their superior judgment, struggled to maintain their dignity. "Well," Thomas finally said, standing up stiffly, "perhaps we could all have dinner next week. Your father-in-law still has some connections that might be useful." "I appreciate the offer," I replied politely, "but I'm afraid I'm booked solid for the next few months. Board meetings, investor calls, expansion planning, you understand." They left looking deflated, their attempt at reconciliation, or more accurately, their attempt to position themselves to benefit from my success, having failed spectacularly. The following week brought even more chaos as the full extent of my success became public knowledge. Forbes published a feature on Ecometrics AI, highlighting our innovative approach to sustainability and our rapid growth. The article included a photo of me with Jeff Bennett and other industry leaders at the gala, along with details of our recent funding round and global expansion plans. Sarah's social media, once filled with carefully curated photos of charity galas and luxury vacations, fell silent. How could she maintain her image as the successful wife managing her struggling husband when that same struggling husband was now being featured in Forbes? The breaking point came during a dinner party at her friend Rebecca's house, an event Sarah had RSVP'd to weeks before the gala. We arrived to find the dynamic completely shifted. Instead of being seated at the outer edges of the table as usual, we were placed in the positions of honor. Or more accurately, I was. "James, you must tell us about your meeting with the governor," Rebecca's husband called out eagerly. "I heard he's implementing your platform across all state agencies." Sarah sat quietly, pushing food around her plate as I discussed business with the very people who had previously ignored me at these gatherings. The same crowd that had once smiled politely through her excuses about my computer project was now hanging on my every word. "The environmental impact metrics are quite remarkable," I explained, watching as they nodded along enthusiastically. "We're seeing reduction in carbon footprints of up to 40% in some sectors." "Fascinating," Rebecca exclaimed, touching my arm familiarly. "Sarah, you must be so proud. Although," she paused, her smile taking on a sharp edge, "I recall you telling us just last month that James was still finding his direction." The table fell silent. All eyes turned to Sarah, who looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. I might have understated things," she managed weakly. "Understated?" Charlotte chimed in, clearly enjoying the moment. "Darling, you spent the last 3 years telling us he was playing with computers. Meanwhile, he was building a billion-dollar company." The rest of the dinner was excruciating for Sarah. Every conversation seemed to circle back to my success and, by extension, her previous dismissal of it. The same friends who had once sympathetically listened to her complaints about my career choices now seemed eager to highlight her lack of faith in me. On the drive home, Sarah finally broke down. "I don't understand," she said, her voice cracking. "Why didn't you tell me all those times when I said—" She couldn't seem to finish her sentences. "Would you have believed me?" I asked quietly, keeping my eyes on the road. "When I tried to explain the potential of the platform, you called it my little hobby. When I talked about investor meetings, you suggested I focus on real job opportunities. At what point should I have told you about my success, Sarah? When you were comparing me to James from your office, or maybe when you were apologizing to your friends about my lack of ambition?" She flinched at each example, probably remembering the countless times she'd done exactly those things. "But I'm your wife," she whispered. "We're supposed to be partners." "Partners?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Partners support each other, Sarah. Partners believe in each other. You spent years trying to change me into someone you wouldn't be embarrassed by. That's not partnership. That's management." "I was, just trying to help," she protested. "I wanted you to be successful." No, I corrected her, pulling into our driveway. You wanted me to fit your definition of success. You never once considered that I might achieve success on my own terms. The next few days were tense. Sarah oscillated between attempts to apologize and moments of defensive anger. She'd start a conversation with, "I'm sorry I didn't believe in..." You blend it with, "But how was I supposed to know? You kept everything secret." Her social circle was equally in turmoil. The same friends who had once nodded sympathetically as she bemoaned my career choices were now frantically trying to establish connections with me. LinkedIn requests poured in from people who had previously looked through me at parties. Each notification was another reminder of how quickly people's perceptions could change when money and success entered the picture. As the dust began to settle from the gala revelation, Sarah's attempt to salvage her social standing became increasingly desperate. She started posting old photos of us on social media, trying to rewrite our narrative. Throwback to when my brilliant husband was developing his groundbreaking platform, always knew he would change the world. Proud wife. Innovation. Success. The easy comment section was merciless. "Didn't you call it his little computer hobby at the Thompsons' dinner?" one friend commented. Another chimed in. "Funny, I remember you suggesting he take that junior analyst position at Morgan Stanley just last month." But the real wake-up call came during her weekly lunch with her closest friends. I heard about it later from Charlotte, who seemed to take particular delight in reporting the details. Sarah tried to play it off like she'd been your biggest supporter all along, Charlotte told me, having stopped by my office under the pretense of discussing a potential investment. But Rebecca had receipts, actual text messages, where Sarah called your work a waste of time and complained about your lack of ambition. It was brutal. Meanwhile, my world continued to expand. Ecometrics AI was growing faster than ever, with major corporations implementing our platform across their global operations. Jeff Bennett and I were finalizing details for a joint venture in Asia, and the governor's office was using our success as a model for statewide environmental initiatives. Sarah attempted to insert herself into this new reality, showing up unannounced. "At my office one day, I thought I'd bring you lunch," she said brightly, holding up a bag from an expensive deli. "Maybe we could discuss your upcoming projects. I have some ideas about social media strategy." My assistant, Jenny, looked at me questioningly. She had been with me since the early days and had heard plenty of Sarah's dismissive comments about our work. "I'm afraid I'm busy," I said politely. "Board meeting in 10 minutes. Jenny, could you please show Mrs. Mitchell out?" The look on Sarah's face, a mixture of hurt and indignation, spoke volumes. She wasn't used to being dismissed, especially not in front of others. "But I'm your wife," she protested. "Surely you can make time for..." "Like you made time to understand my work before it was featured in Forbes?" I interrupted quietly. "Jenny, the board is waiting." As Jenny led her out, I could hear Sarah's heels clicking angrily on the marble floor. It was probably the first time in our marriage that she'd been the one feeling dismissed and minimized. Later that evening, I found her waiting in our living room, surrounded by papers. "I've been doing research," she announced, gesturing to the scattered documents, "reading everything I can find about Ecometrics AI, sustainable technology, environmental impact assessment. I want to understand. I want to be part of this." I looked at the papers, printouts of articles, company reports, market analyses. "Why now, Sarah? Because it's successful? Because it impresses your friends? Or because you finally realize that my work wasn't just a hobby to keep me occupied?" "That's not fair," she protested. "I'm trying here. I'm trying to show you that I can be the supportive wife you need." "The supportive wife I need?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Sarah, I needed a supportive wife 3 years ago when I was working late nights coding. I needed a supportive wife when I was missing social events to meet with potential investors. I needed a supportive wife when your brother was mocking my dreams at family dinners. Now, I gestured to the papers, now I need a wife who understands why her sudden interest in my success feels like too little, too late. She sat there, perfectly manicured hands, clutching a Forbes article about our latest funding round, looking lost in what had once been her carefully controlled world. "I didn't know," she whispered. "How could I have known?" "You could have asked," I replied simply. "You could have listened. You could have believed in me just once, instead of constantly trying to fix me." The aftermath of our conversation rippled through every aspect of our lives. Sarah's carefully constructed social world had crumbled, replaced by an uncomfortable new reality where she was no longer the successful wife managing her struggling husband, but rather the foolish wife who had failed to recognize her husband's potential. Her parents attempted another reconciliation, this time with a more strategic approach. They hosted a dinner party, inviting several of their high society friends who they thought might interest me professionally. The evening was a masterclass. In irony, the same people who had previously dismissed me were now hanging on my every word. "James," Thomas announced, raising his glass, "I want to propose a toast to my visionary son-in-law. I always knew you had it in you." The room fell silent. Sarah nearly choked on her wine. "Did you?" I asked mildly. "Was that before or after you suggested I take that entry-level position at your golf buddy's insurance company?" Victoria jumped in quickly, trying to smooth over the awkward moment. "What matters is family, and we're all so proud of what you've accomplished." "Proud," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Interesting how pride follows success, isn't it?" The dinner continued in this vein, with Sarah's parents and their friends attempting to rewrite history while I calmly reminded them of their past behavior. Each interaction was a subtle reminder of how dramatically things had changed. Meanwhile, Sarah was struggling to find her footing in this new dynamic. She'd started attending tech conferences, trying to understand my world, but her attempts felt forced and desperate. During one particularly painful incident, she tried to engage Jeff Bennett in a conversation about AI algorithms at a charity gala. "The neural networks," she said, clearly reciting from memorized articles, "are particularly innovative in their approach to carbon footprint calculation." Jeff looked at me with barely concealed amusement. "Indeed," he replied politely, before turning back to our discussion about the Asian market expansion. The social fallout continued to spread. Sarah's friends, who had once nodded sympathetically through her complaints about my career choices, were now avoiding her. Her carefully curated Instagram following had dropped significantly, and her usual lunch companions suddenly had scheduling conflicts. One evening, I found her sitting in our home office, surrounded by tech magazines and industry reports. "Did you know," she said without looking up, "that the environmental technology sector is projected to reach $2.5 trillion by 2027. Your platform is perfectly positioned to capture a significant market share." "Yes, Sarah," I replied tiredly. "I did know that. I knew it 3 years ago when I was explaining it to you over dinner. And you suggested I look into pharmaceutical sales instead." She flinched but pressed on. "I'm trying to understand your world now. I want to be involved." "My world?" I sat down across from her. "This isn't about understanding my world, Sarah. It's about you trying to regain control of your narrative. You're not interested in what I've built. You're interested in how it affects your social standing." "That's not true," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "I just want to be a part of your success." "A part of my success," I repeated slowly. "Not a part of my journey, not a part of my struggle, not a part of my vision, just my success." The truth of it hung heavy in the air between us. Sarah had always been interested in success, just not in the work it took to achieve it. She'd wanted the end result, without understanding or appreciating the journey. Later that week, I received an email from Charlotte. She'd attached screenshots of text messages from the past few years, conversations where Sarah had dismissed my work, mocked my ambitions, and complained about my lack of real success. The messages were damning, showing a clear pattern of belittlement and dismissal. "Thought you should see these," Charlotte wrote. "Consider it my way of apologizing for not seeing your potential sooner." I didn't need to see the messages. I had lived through each dismissive comment, each belittling remark. But they served as a stark reminder of how completely Sarah had failed to believe in me, and how transparent her current attempts at support really were. The final breaking point came during a major tech conference in San Francisco. Ecometrics. AI was being featured as a case study in sustainable innovation, and I was scheduled to give the keynote address. Sarah had insisted on attending, dressed impeccably in what she called her tech CEO's wife outfit. Before my speech, we were mingling with industry leaders when Marcus approached with an unexpected guest, James from Sarah's office, the same. James she'd spent years comparing me to. "James here is interested in implementing our platform at his firm," Marcus explained, clearly unaware of the history. Sarah froze, her champagne glass halfway to her lips. This was the man she'd held up as an example of real success for years, the one whose career path she'd constantly suggested I emulate. "Actually," James said, looking uncomfortable, "I've been following Ecometrics AI's progress for months. The innovation you've brought to the sector is remarkable. We'd love to discuss potential implementation across our global offices." I watched Sarah's face as her carefully constructed worldview crumbled yet again. The man she'd placed on a pedestal was now essentially asking to become my client. "Of course," I replied professionally. "Have your team reach out to Jenny, my assistant. She'll set up a meeting." The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew our history. Sarah excused herself shortly after, and I found her later in a quiet corner, frantically wiping away tears that threatened to ruin her perfect makeup. "I got it all wrong," she whispered when I approached. "All these years, I thought I knew what success looked like. I thought I was pushing you toward something better, but I was actually standing in my way." I finished for her. She nodded, unable to meet my eyes. "I keep thinking about all the times I dismissed your work, compared you to James, tried to make you into something you weren't. And now, here we are, and he's asking to be your client, and I don't know how to process that." "The problem, Sarah, isn't that you got it wrong. The problem is that you never took the time to get it right. You were so busy trying to mold me into your version of success that you never bothered to understand my vision of it." The conference proved to be a turning point, but not in the way Sarah had hoped. While Ecometrics AI continued to soar with new partnerships and expansions announced almost weekly, our marriage had reached a point of no return. The trust that had been broken through years of dismissal and belittlement couldn't be repaired with sudden support and understanding. We separated, quietly, a few months later. Sarah tried to maintain her social standing, but the narrative had shifted too dramatically. She was no longer the successful wife managing her struggling husband. She was the foolish woman who had failed to recognize and support her visionary husband's potential. The last time I saw her was at another Morgan Stanley event, almost. A year after the original gala. She was there with her family, watching from across the room as I announced Ecometrics AI's latest achievement, a groundbreaking partnership with a consortium of global tech leaders. As I stood at the podium, I caught her eye in the crowd. She looked different, smaller somehow, less certain of her place in this world she had once navigated so confidently. Her carefully curated image had crumbled, replaced by the reality of someone who had measured success by all the wrong metrics. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone who knew our story. Success isn't always visible in the ways people expect. It doesn't always wear designer suits or drive luxury cars. Sometimes it drives a Toyota and works late nights on a little computer project. Sometimes it quietly builds something revolutionary, while others dismiss it as impractical. But most importantly, success isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right. And sometimes the people closest to us are the last ones to recognize that truth. As I concluded my speech to thunderous applause, I realized that my journey had come full circle. The husband Sarah had been embarrassed by was now the success story she'd always wanted, just not in the way she'd imagined. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.